The outcome of the Second World War turned on a single, absurd detail. A sleeping man no one dared to wake. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest invasion fleet in history approached the French coast. German officers screamed into telephones, begging for the release of the Panzer tanks that were parked just hours from Normandy. Those tanks had the power to crush the Allied beachhead before it could even form. However, they couldn't move without a direct order from Adolf Hitler. Hitler was asleep at his holiday home, having taken a sedative the night before. This is the story of the 6 most expensive hours in military history. By 1944, Nazi propaganda had convinced the world that the French coast was impenetrable. They called it the Atlantic Wall. Newsreels showed endless lines of concrete bunkers, heavy artillery, and beach obstacles designed to rip landing craft apart. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, had spent months personally overseeing these defenses. He planted millions of mines and drove stakes into the sand to impale gliders. Yet Rommel knew a secret that the propaganda reels didn't show. The wall wasn't finished. There were huge gaps in the line, and the German army was stretched thin across thousands of miles of coastline. Rommel knew that if the Allies ever got a foothold, Germany would lose. The only way to win was to stop the invasion on the waterline within the first 24 hours. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, but they were looking at the wrong place. This was no accident. The Allies had created a phantom army in southeast England, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and a very real General George Patton commanding it all. They called it Operation Fortitude. It was designed to sell one specific lie, that the invasion would hit Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It worked perfectly. Hitler became obsessed with Calais. He kept his strongest army, the 15th Army, parked there, waiting for a fight that would never come. When the real ships appeared off Normandy, German high command hesitated because they assumed this massive fleet was just a diversion to draw their forces away from the real target. Bad luck often decides battles before they begin. On June 4, the weather in the English Channel turned terrible. Gales and rain battered the coast. The German meteorologists told their commanders that an invasion was impossible in these conditions. Secure in this report, Erwin Rommel decided to take a few days off. He got into his car and drove back to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday. He brought her a pair of gray suede shoes from Paris as a gift. So, on the night of June 5th, while the Allied fleet sailed through the storm, the one German commander who understood the danger was 500 miles away in Herrlingen, sleeping in his own bed. The defense of Normandy was effectively headless. The real problem wasn't just Rommel's absence, it was the chaotic way Hitler ran his army. He didn't trust his generals, so he split the command of the armored divisions. There were 3 powerful tank units near Normandy: the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, the Panzer Lehr, and the 21st Panzer Division. Rommel wanted them right on the beaches. His rival, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, wanted them held back near Paris to launch a massive counterattack once the invasion site was confirmed. Hitler chose a compromise that was worse than either plan. He gave Rommel control of only 3 divisions, but he kept the 4 strongest ones, including the Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS, under his personal command as the OKW Reserve. No one could move these tanks without Hitler's explicit permission. Chaos broke out shortly after midnight. American and British paratroopers dropped into the dark fields behind the beaches. The reports reaching German headquarters were panicked and contradictory. Some said it was a major attack, while others claimed they were fighting plastic dummies rigged with firecrackers. That second claim was actually true in some sectors, which was another Allied trick. General Marx, commanding the 84th Corps in Normandy, was one of the first to realize this was the real deal. At 2:15 a.m., the 21st Panzer Division, commanded by Edgar Feuchtinger, was ready to move. They were parked just south of Caen. Feuchtinger could have driven his tanks straight to the coast and crushed the British paratroopers before dawn. But his orders were strict: stay put until told otherwise. So the engines remained cold. By 4:30 a.m., the reports were too consistent to ignore. Ships were appearing on radar screens. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief West, was an old-school Prussian officer who had often clashed with Hitler. He was in his headquarters in Paris, looking at the map. He saw the scale of the airborne drops and realized this was not a drill. He immediately ordered the 12th SS and the Panzer Lehr divisions to prepare for movement toward Normandy. These were two of the most fearsome armored units in existence. The Panzer Lehr alone had hundreds of tanks and armored half-tracks. Moving them now would put them on the beaches by noon. But there was a catch. Rundstedt had the authority to prepare them, but not to release them into combat. For that, he had to call the Berghof. If you are fascinated by how small moments change history, make sure to subscribe. We release detailed investigations like this every week. Now we return to the bunker. The call went through to Berchtesgaden, Hitler's retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Rundstedt's chief of staff spoke to General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff. It was not yet dawn. Rundstedt's request was clear: release the reserves immediately. Jodl's answer was the definition of bureaucratic paralysis. He refused. He said he needed to confirm the situation himself, and more importantly, he could not authorize the movement without the Führer's concurrence. When asked to wake Hitler, Jodl balked. Hitler had gone to bed around 3 a.m. after listening to Wagner and discussing films. He had given strict orders not to be disturbed. Jodl, terrified of Hitler's temper and sticking rigidly to protocol, decided the war could wait until his boss woke up naturally. While the Atlantic Wall was being breached, Adolf Hitler was sound asleep in his plush bedroom at the Berghof. His lifestyle had become increasingly erratic by 1944. He was a night owl, often working or ranting to his inner circle until the early morning hours, fueled by nervous energy and a cocktail of drugs administered by his physician, Theodore Morel. On this specific night, he had taken a sedative to ensure he got his rest. The Berghof was quiet. The guards patrolled the perimeter, and the staff tiptoed through the halls. It is a staggering image. The supreme commander of the German military, the man who demanded total control over every machine gun nest, was unconscious during the most critical invasion in history, protected by a wall of silence his own fear had created. This delay wasn't just a paperwork issue. It was a matter of life and death. At 6:30 a.m., American troops hit Omaha Beach. Things went wrong immediately. The currents pushed landing craft off target, and the aerial bombardment had missed the German bunkers. The Americans were pinned down at the water's edge, taking catastrophic casualties. For about 4 hours, the fate of the invasion hung by a thread. The German infantry on the bluffs were holding the line, but they were running low on ammunition. If the Panzer Lehr division had been released at 4:30 a.m. when Rundstedt asked, their advance elements could have been approaching the beachhead by mid-morning. They would have caught the Americans while they were still trapped on the sand. It would have been a massacre. Closer to the action, the 21st Panzer Division was still sitting idle. General Feuchtinger was in a panic. He could hear the battle. He knew British troops were advancing on Caen. Yet, without orders from Rommel or Hitler, he was paralyzed. Finally, Around 6:30 a.m., he decided he couldn't wait anymore and ordered some of his tanks to move. But he sent them to the wrong place. He sent them to fight paratroopers east of the Orne River instead of attacking the beaches. Valuable fuel and time were wasted chasing scattered infantry while the main invasion force was landing unopposed just a few miles away. The lack of a unified command meant that the only available tank division was being used as a fire brigade for minor skirmishes. As the morning wore on, the sun burned off the mist. This was bad news for the Germans. The Allied air forces, which had been hampered by the storm, started to fill the sky. In Paris, Rundstedt was furious. He was on the phone constantly, screaming at the staff at OKW to ask if Hitler was awake. But at the Berghof, the answer remained no. The staff knew that waking Hitler with bad news was dangerous. They preferred to wait until he rang his bell for breakfast. Meanwhile, on the beaches, the Americans at Omaha were beginning to break through the defenses. The British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword were already pushing inland. The window to throw them back into the sea was closing minute by minute. Adolf Hitler finally emerged from his bedroom around noon. He was groggy but in a decent mood. His valet, Heinz Ling, and his naval adjutant were the first to see him. When they finally told him about the landings in Normandy, Hitler didn't explode in rage. Instead, he seemed almost relieved. He had been waiting for the invasion for months, and now the tension was broken. But he also didn't take it seriously. He reportedly said this was it, but he still believed it was a diversion. He thought the real attack was coming at Calais. He sat down for his daily military conference, listening to Jodel's briefing. It was a surreal scene to discuss a battle that had been raging for 6 hours as if it had just begun. Even after he was awake, Hitler didn't immediately release the Panzers. He spent time analyzing the reports, looking for signs of the real invasion at Calais. It wasn't until around 4 p.m., nearly 10 hours after the first landings, that he finally authorized the release of the 12th SS and the Panzer Lehr divisions. By military standards, a 10-hour delay in a blitzkrieg war is an eternity. When the order finally reached the tank commanders, they were exhausted from waiting. They fired up their engines and began the long drive to the coast. However, the battlefield had changed completely since 4 a.m. The Allies were ashore. Their artillery was set up, and the sky above France now belonged to the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces. If the tanks had moved at night or in the early morning mist, they could have traveled relatively safely. Moving in the late afternoon was suicide. As the Panzer Lehr division rolled out onto the French roads, they were spotted immediately. Allied fighter bombers, known as Jabos to the Germans, swooped down on the columns. They bombed bridges, strafed supply trucks, and blew up tanks. The German columns were forced to scatter and hide in the woods, only moving in short bursts. The commander of the Panzer Lehr, Fritz Behrlein, described the march as a witch's cauldron. By the time they actually reached the front line the next day, they had already lost men and vehicles, without firing a single shot at an Allied soldier. The delay had cost them their mobility. The only unit that managed to attack on D-Day was the 21st Panzer Division, and their story shows what might have been. Late in the afternoon, they finally found a gap between the British and Canadian beaches. They drove straight for the sea. At around 8 p.m., a few German tanks actually reached the coast at Luc-sur-Mer. They looked out and saw the English Channel filled with thousands of Allied ships, but they were alone. There was no Panzer Lehr to support them, no 12th SS to widen the breach. British anti-tank guns were closing in on their flanks, and a massive glider wave landed right behind them to reinforce the British line. Fearing encirclement, the 21st Panzer retreated. The only German tanks to see the ocean on D-Day turned around and drove away. While his tanks were being bombed and his beaches overrun, Erwin Rommel was frantically driving back from Germany. He had left early in the morning, the moment he heard the news, but the drive took all day. He didn't arrive at his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon until late that night, around 10 p.m. By then, the Allies had landed over 150,000 men. The Atlantic Wall was broken. Rommel looked at the maps and reportedly said that if he was commander of the Allied forces, he could finish the war in 14 days. He knew the chance to push them back into the sea had existed only in those first few hours. The birthday trip and the sleeping Führer had conspired to hand the Allies the victory. Historians have debated for decades whether it would have mattered. If Jodl had woken Hitler at 4 a.m. and the tanks had moved immediately, could Germany have won D-Day? Many experts argue that Allied naval gunfire and air power were so overwhelming that the tanks would have been destroyed anyway. But others point to Omaha Beach. The Americans were so close to breaking there. A counterattack by fresh Panzer divisions at 9 a.m. could have split the Allied forces and caused a panic. It might not have won the war for Germany, but it could have turned D-Day into a disaster for the Allies, delaying the liberation of Europe by a year or more. The scary part is how close it came to happening. The failure on D-Day was the ultimate failure of the Nazi system. Hitler had built a regime based on the Führer principle, the idea that one man's will was law. In practice, it meant that thousands of officers were too terrified to make a decision without him. The most powerful military machine in Europe was paralyzed because a valet was afraid to knock on a door. In a democracy or even a traditional army, a deputy would have authorized the tanks. In Hitler's bunker, initiative was a death sentence. The centralization of power, which was supposed to make Germany strong, became its fatal weakness at the decisive moment. By the night of June 6, the Allies held 5 beachheads. They would never be pushed back. The German generals spent the next weeks fighting a defensive war they knew they couldn't win. Rommel was wounded by an airstrike in July and forced to commit suicide in October. Rundstedt was fired, then rehired, then fired again. And Hitler retreated further into his delusions, eventually moving to the bunker in Berlin, where he would end his life less than a year later. But the road to that Berlin bunker began in the bedroom of the Berghof. The 6 hours he spent sleeping bought the world its freedom. By the night of June 6, the Allies held 5 beachheads. They would never be pushed back. The German generals spent the next weeks fighting a defensive war they knew they couldn't win. Rommel was wounded by an airstrike in July and forced to commit suicide in October. Rundstedt was fired, then rehired, then fired again. And Hitler? He retreated further into his delusions, eventually moving to the bunker in Berlin where he would end his life less than a year later. But the road to that Berlin bunker began in the bedroom of the Berghof. The 6 hours he spent sleeping bought the world its freedom. History is often taught as a collision of massive forces, of economies and ideologies. Sometimes, however, it comes down to the smallest human frailties. A birthday party, a storm, and a sleeping pill. The liberation of Europe owed as much to a German sleeping habit as it did to Allied strategy. It reminds us that no matter how powerful a system appears, it is only as strong as the people running it. If you enjoyed this look into the major moments of history, subscribe for more stories like this.